Repurpose is something we as architects love to do. We repurpose forms in nature, we repurpose social media, we repurpose science we find, but the question is why? The two issues architecture is struggling forever with. The one thing is the relationship with our built environment and nature, and obviously today that quest and that issue is even heightened and more urgent with global warming and with the rising of the sea levels. The other big issue is the relationship between architecture and humanity. And looking into society today in Western world, we have an aging society, and with that actually we explore that more and more of our architectural infrastructure is actually not fit for the change of the demographics. But let's start with nature. When I teach at Penn, I always ask at the first day my students, what do you need to do to protect the environment? And they're coming up with saying like, oh, I have to drive a Prius, or I have to recycle, all these great ideas. But what they're not aware of is actually that what the industry they're in is causing 40% of all energy being consumed globally. And that means it's for the construction of architecture, but it's also for the operation of it. So I don't actually mind if they're driving a Humvee, as long as the design is sustainable. You know that today we have amazing sustainable buildings all over the world. They're popping up in New York, for example, the Hertz building, fascinating from Sir Norman Foster. But so now here's the problem. You see this building, it's beautiful, it's great architecture, but it doesn't do anything for the people from the outside to change their mind about the relationship to nature. Yeah. There's nothing which communicates the issues which this building is dealing with. You need to read about it. So this is something what we actually became inspired by Al Gore a couple of years ago when he started Life Earth. This was an event which was not sustainable itself. It actually cost 200,000 tons of carbon. But it used a pop event to actually change the mind of people, for them to change their way of life. And architecture in the most recent years became pop, so why not using that as an added benefit for then just being sustainable in terms of the architectural, the product. So one project we got involved in was for Mini Cooper from the BMW brand, where they asked us to design green roofs in Manhattan. And we were like, hey, this is a great idea, but let's not just make green roofs, let's make an event space that is a green roof, and that is something which communicates more than just pure nature on built environments. Of course, I have to admit, what you see here, 95% of that roof is dead and manufactured, and it was also semi-sustainable because it was demolished after these events. But the realness of that kind of hybrid of a familiar, unfamiliar form giving of that little hill, but then the realness of that grass on top of this hill was something which actually in New York had a surprising and very intense effect. All these people came visit, and you know New Yorkers, they have no boundaries, but suddenly they saw this hill and they became holy, and they were really afraid to touch it and was like, oh, what is this, where it's coming from, and so on. Of course, after 2 drinks, everybody jumped onto it and they enjoyed it excessively on every kind of level. But what we heard from people afterwards was that actually they could smell the grass and they could feel it, and they had different conversations, and they discussed about being somewhere else than in Manhattan and enjoying this kind of nature. Which actually brought us to this point is that actually one of the reasons why why we live such an unsustainable life is because we are not engaged with the natural environment. And this is actually something what architecture could, when we think it further, could provide. So now the mini rooftop was like a little experiment, but if we translate that actually to a scale bigger, or many scales bigger, we come to something we in our office call iconic design. Ecology and icon. Iconic design is basically creating buildings which become inspirations for a change in our lifestyle. Something where we use nature, repurpose forms of nature, actually to remind people about what is out there and what is worth to protect. This is maybe a very simple juxtaposition here, which I can show you. But on the right side, you see a chair from Mies van der Rohe. And what do you think about it? Well, it's modernism, it's architecture, it's cool, it's beautifully designed. But on the other side, you see a rock from nature. And what you now envision, what is implanted in your mind, it's very different. So this is what we are after with this idea of iconic design. And this is Magic Mountain, and I'm going to tell a little bit more about it in a little while. But this is the kind of calm and the kind of cute version of this. But we also have something else in iconic design. We call it the scare factor. This is Sky Grove. Can you imagine when we built this in New York? People look at it, it's like, okay, this is weird, what is this all about? And we can tell them, this is for the preparation for the rising sea levels. And it's like, really? Yes, this is the anticipation of a future we have to deal with. And by creating that kind of very symbolic, but also in terms of architecture, because it's a reference to mangroves, it's a structural necessity, and it's basically a survival kind of strategy for a potential striking disaster. It is something which, again, creates a different awareness for the people experiencing and seeing it. And this is something we actually miss in America. When you look in the Netherlands, you have the sluices all over the country, which need to be closed 15 times per year. At least that was anticipated, that they needed to close them 15 times to protect the country against drowning, basically, against flooding. What actually happened, now they have to close it 45 times. But no wonder that actually the Netherlands, it's one of the countries which are absolutely in the forefront about sustainability and architecture, which is very ecological. But now on the stilt roots, this is a positive message which excites us, is that we created this new type of ecology, which again mangroves are creating, so that actually the Hudson River can regain its natural heritage. And that is something where I can come to another level we learned in our work, is that actually with like scientific findings and clues which we can come up in our design process, we can actually envision a whole nother level of the purpose from architecture and the engagement for nature. And as mentioned before, we were invited to design the future for Atlanta in 100 years from now. That was a commission from the History Channel. And what we did was we looked into clues of today, how science is actually evolving, and we looked into these clues and used them in a creative fashion. Here, for example, we found out that the DNA sequence of trees was recently decoded, and with that, all the potential to manipulate plants is in our hands. We also found out that at MIT, they created a chip, and they merged the chip with a spinach plant, and the chip was powered for 6 weeks by the energy of the plant. So now, if you put these two things together, you actually come to a new idea of the power plant. So we're basically the power plant, where basically the nature is able to provide our architectural infrastructure with the energy it needs. So I presented this at TEDU a couple of years ago in Monterey, and Greg Venter started to laugh, and he was cracking up. It's like, whoa, 100 years? You're crazy. We can do that in 10. So in 10 years, or now in 8 years, Atlanta, the city of trees, going to be recalled or renamed Metropolis. Metropolis is a beautiful new vision of a new kind of symbiotic relationship between architecture and nature. Obviously, we still have developers who abuse our environment, and here they just build their little developer box on top of that beautiful kind of new natural landscape. But what we find so interesting is in a lot of the discourse of today, we say like we may have to go back to nature to be able to live in tune with nature again. But what we are saying is actually let's fast forward nature to be in tune with us. And also, obviously, we don't want to erase all of the heritage of today of cities. And as you can maybe see, we love the Marriott Marquis here in Atlanta. So we want to save it, and we create this kind of adaptive structure where architecture and the nature really create kind of this new hybrid to live in tune with each other. But on the more sociological level, what excited us is also we erased streetscapes, and it became this much more democratic and liberal kind of landscape we as architects are aiming for. And this is also which it gave us clues about this relationship about humanity and architecture. And as I mentioned before, there's an issue which is cooking or heating up in Western society. And that is about basically the aging of the population. This is a typical nursing home, and you have 17,000 Medicare, Medicaid facilities in America, and they all look like this. And 1/3 of every American gonna live in one of these nursing homes, and that person gonna live there in average 850 days. So it's basically a storing device for the elderly, and this is something which absolutely is urgent to rethink, and our idea is to repurpose the life of the elderly. But we have tried that in America. We had commissions to redesign a nursing home, and we always run against walls, and we actually had to be called to Africa, of all places, to make a difference. This is a project in Ivory Coast, which is very close to Abidjan, which is the main kind of economical center of the country. And it's absolutely far away embedded in nature next to a beautiful lagoon. The exciting thing was that we went there with our client, this is Priest Raoul, and he had a negotiation with the chief of the village. And when they discussed, basically the priest asked, hey, can I get a land so that I can build this retirement community for my priests? And the chief was like, yes, you can, but what do you do for me? And the priest came back, said like, I built you a school. So by just saying, I built you a school, he changed everything what basically is to be expected from a retirement community. He started to mix different generations. He repurposed the life of the elderly priests, because now they can teach, now they can entertain, now they're being engaged with the village people, and with that actually a much more fulfilling final years is enabled. For us it's important with this kind of work, especially when we go out of our kind of comfort level of being in the Western world, is that we actually don't come with, here is our idea and this is how you have to do it. It's actually much more interesting by working on workshops and learning about all this kind of specificities of our country, and about also different ways of working together. So we didn't have to have really big meetings set it up. It was very informal, and this was, for example, the Secretary of State talking to the priest on the floor, and everybody's getting excited about this project. And architecturally, what became interesting for us, it became a hybrid between a very typical village in Ivory Coast and connected to the beautiful landscape, obviously, which we wanted architecturally to fuse. On top of it, there's a very exciting heritage we don't want to kind of push aside and use that what the villagers have done for many, many years, but also in the 60s, they have this absolutely stunning, cool, modernist kind of African kind of language they created. So what we did, we actually mixed all of this together and really wanted to repurpose the idea of the African village, repurpose the idea of the formal language from the heritage within the country. And then it became a blend between, on the one hand, just the nature which kind of warps over the architectural landscape, but then on the other side, it becomes actually super urban, and that becomes where actually society meets and greets. Which is also important because what we want to create for the elderly is that they have choice. They don't want to be exposed to the kids at some point. They want to meditate, they want to go into the green, and all of this is actually already part of the organization of that neighborhood. And then obviously there are a lot of other kind of aspects coming in. It's kind of microfinancing, also new building technologies. But most important is actually that, especially because in Africa, rural urbanism still can work because you have the proximity towards nature, and with that you can harvest a lot of the nutrition people need. It's actually that re-embedding the elderly into the natural environment is a very clear benefit. And obviously we also were very kind of driven by creating icons for themselves, but in this case just iconographic and not iconic, since everything else has already its own kind of purpose within the architectural language. But so this was Africa, but what do we do now in our environment? And I had this opportunity to work with the Bauhaus Foundation in Germany on idea of a city in 2030 being ready also for these changes in the society. We called it Acropolis, the city of the elderly. And what we did was actually we used a very typical city of Germany with its three typologies of suburbia, inner city areas, and Siedlungen, which are this kind of big block architectures. And we associated different lifestyle groups to it, and then we looked into what kind of architectural forms and strategies can be infused, which then help that people can stay actually at the locations where they are and being supported with the necessary programs and support structures. So one of them, for example, here you see in suburbia, we repurposed a street with public functions so that you have on-demand clinic, you have on-demand provision with food and other services. But of course, don't take these forms too serious, but also in our work, we want to be visionary and want to outline at least some of the kind of ideas and architectural tools, what we fascinated with. And here, obviously, we didn't want to use other residential buildings. We wanted to challenge architecture, the typical infrastructure of streets, to make it all accessible and very easily usable. And this goes on, for example, also in these huge mega structures in Germany. There are 1 million apartments empty in East Germany. Why not repurposing them? There you have traditionalists who live in East Germany in this kind of buildings. Why not carve out a type of market space, a little village within the architecture, or create a church? Germany tends to still be Christian. Let's give it to them, or a mosque, whatever it's appropriate in that kind of area. And last but not least, now I close the circle. This is, again, it's Magic Mountain, where Magic Mountain originally was born out of a necessity to re-attract immigrants, aging immigrants, into Germany. Because the fact is that actually 20% of all Germans want to move away when they're older, out of financial reasons, but also it's more beautiful to be probably in Spain. And the problem is when 3 people leave Germany, that means Germany loses 1 job. And since the jobless rate is at 14%, it's important to keep actually people in the country. So we looked into a strategy, how can we do that? First of all, with a form which is exotic, but then also with like a whole strategy of layering of programs which help basically to make people to feel at home and to be able to live all the remaining years in one typical in one kind of architectural condition. And as you have seen from all the work which I have shown you in my 18 minutes, which are up now, is that we are architects, we like to build, but we also architects who like to dream. And this is something which became very clear to us when we worked with Barack Obama on a project which was a real renovation of a youth shelter in Washington, D.C., and which became for him the call for service with a live cast of 300 million people. And if just 1% of 1% has seen this, then that is already a huge change which can happen without actually a real big bombastic kind of architectural project. And this is something what we like with symbolism, with integrations, and also with working partially with media. So for example, also presenting here is something where we believe we can do an impact beyond just a physical space we can create. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthias.